recording. So welcome. I'm really, really happy to have you here, Idel. Dr. Porter we used to work at the same department, so I'm really to be reunited, even it's just virtually, but we're still here. So I'm going to introduce you I'm going to introduce Idel Porter to you. So she is a lecturer at the University of Castilla-La Mancha, where she teaches historical linguistics and Old English language and literature. The subject of a doctoral thesis, which she earned at the University of Leeds in 2008, was a comparative analysis of translations of skaldic poetry, and most research also focused on skaldic poetry. Most recent work is depictions of emotions in literature. Her current project is a volume co-edited with Professor Javier Diaz-Vera, also he's a professor at University of La Mancha, and this is entitled Common Models for Emotions in the North Atlantic Vernaculars from the year 700 to the year 1400, which should be published this year. I'm really, really curious to hear more about these the myth of the poetic me.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you very much, Amaya, for having me, and to the University of del País Vasco and Departamento de Filología Inglesa y Alemán y Traducción y Interpretación, que tenéis muchas cosas ahí en vuestro departamento. Buenas tardes a todos. Well, I can speak Spanish. I've been living here for a long time, but I'm going to give my lecture today in English. However, I'm happy to, if anyone wants to ask in Spanish, I'm happy to answer questions in Spanish too. So I'm just going to try, see if I can share my PowerPoint presentation. Is that okay? Can you see?
That's fine.
Fine. Okay. Please tell me if it's a very strange situation. I'm sure you all find when you can't really see what people's faces, or if they can hear you or see what you're doing. So just let me know if there's a problem. So I'm really looking forward to telling you about this, because maybe you haven't had much experience with Old Norse literature. So about almost exactly 700 years ago today, the Icelandic poet and scholar Snorri Sturluson was working on a treatise on the art of poetry. So this text is usually known as the Prose Edda. The image you can see is from an 18th century manuscript, and it sometimes is known as Snorra Edda after him. So there's 3 sections in this book. The first part, Gylfaginning, deals with the history of the story of creation and the destruction of the world by the gods, as well as other aspects of mythology. The third section, Hautatal, is concerned with poetic meters, but it's the second book, or the second part, that we're interested in, Skáldskaparmál, which is the language of poetry, or poetic diction. And this section of the book is where Snorri explains, most of this part is an attempt on Snorri's part to explain the mythological allusions behind the kennings which occur with such frequency in skaldic verse. Now, any of you who have studied Old English will probably already know a little bit about kennings, but just to refresh your memories in case you don't remember. So a kenning is sort of like a metaphor, although not exactly. So it's a poetic circumlocution whereby, in its most simplest form, we use 2 words, 2 nouns, to refer to a third meaning. These words are usually known as, for example, if we take the example of Whale Road, which occurs in Beowulf, the the word road is the head word, whale is the determinant, and the road of the whale is the sea, because that's where whales travel, like people on a road. To look at an Old Norse example, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. So another example in Old English is sky candle, which refers to the sun. So the candle in the sky is a kind of metaphorical way of thinking about the sun. And these kind of kennings are relatively easy to understand, especially if you read them in context. They make sense. However, in the case of mythological kennings, which are very numerous in skaldic poetry, these are only intelligible really if you have a knowledge of the myth. It's very hard to understand what they mean otherwise, unless you know what they're referring to. So for example, we've got Fafnir's land here. Now that's a kenning for gold. And you could only know that if you knew that Fafnir is that dragon of legend, famously slain by Sigurd or Sigmund. And his land is a synonym here for bed, and the bed of Fafnir is the gold that he lies on, so the treasure. We're very familiar in popular culture with this idea of dragons lying on beds of gold. Well, in Old Norse mythology, there are several kennings that relate to this story. And here's another one. My slide has gone a bit funny here. We've got here Grundr Ægir for some reason in Norse, and that means the land of Ægir, and that is the sea because Ægir is a sea king, a mythological sea king. So these are just a few examples to show you how it's important to know the mythological context in order to understand what the kenning refers to. So when Snorri wrote his treatise, his poetical treatise in the 13th century, the knowledge of the old myths was beginning to be lost. And as Snorri points out, and you can read on the slide, these things have to be told to young poets who desire to learn the language of poetry and to furnish themselves with a wide vocabulary using traditional terms, or else they desire to be able to understand what is expressed obscurely. These stories are not to be consigned to oblivion or demonstrated to be false, so as to deprive poetry of ancient kennings which major poets have been happy to use. Yet Christian people must not believe in heathen gods, nor in the truth of this account any other way than that in which it is presented at the beginning of the book, where it is told what happened when mankind went astray from the true faith, and after that about the Turks and how the people of Asia, known as the Aesir, distorted the accounts of the events that took place in Troy so that the people of the country would believe they were gods. So here we have a typical medieval humoristic attempt to explain the existence of the Old Norse gods. And Snorri explains earlier in the text how the gods really were heroes of a story which evolved in Asia regarding heroes, and that those heroes began to be worshipped as gods. And that's how he explains the pantheon of Old Norse gods. And he's very careful to remind the readers that they should not believe in these old pagan stories. However, at the same time, Snorri is very anxious to retain this knowledge, and so that it shouldn't be lost, because partly I think out of a sense of nostalgia, but also because if this knowledge is lost, then so all those kennings will become meaningless that, as he says, those major poets were happy to use. So that's one of his main purposes in writing this section of the book, is to try to hold on to that knowledge and preserve it for the next generations. Now, so as I said, he's writing about this Skaldskaparmál to explain the mythological stories behind the kennings. So this text is one of our major sources for knowledge about Old Norse mythology, and indeed it's the fullest account of the myth of the poetic Mead. So in the case of this story, Snorri presents it in the context of a conversation between a magician, Ægir, and the god Bragi of poetry. So it's like a dialogue. And they're asking and answering questions again, a typical framework in medieval texts. So Bragi explains how the gods conceal hidden meanings, calling things by another name, and he's referring to kennings here, in a secret language or in poetry. So there's a kind of overlapping or an understanding of kennings as a secret language that belongs to the gods. So it's a divine language. And Ægir says, how did this craft, which you call poetry, originate? So I'll be referring to the names of certain characters as I tell this story, and I've put them on the slide, so maybe it'll be easier for you to follow because they're all in Old Icelandic. So Bragi explains that there's two tribes of gods, the Æsir and the Vanir, and they have been fighting, but they eventually they arrange a truce, and they symbolize their peace treaty by spitting into a vat. And then they decide it's a pity to waste the spittle. So out of the spittle, they make a man called Kvasir up here. And Kvasir is the wisest, is a human, but he's the wisest person ever known. And he can answer he knows the answer to any question, and he travels through the world answering questions for people. But unfortunately, he is killed by two dwarves called Fjalar and Galar, and they kill him, and they drain his blood into 3 containers, and they mix it with honey, and they make a mead, a special mead. So the 2 containers, that's important because I'll be coming back to this point later, are 2 barrels in Icelandic Ker, and their names are Son and Button, and a pot called Odreirir. So they make this this intoxicating drink, this mead, alcoholic drink, and whoever drank of it would become a poet or a wise man. Then the dwarves by accident killed a giant called Gilungur. Here he is. And his son, in retaliation, takes them out to sea and sets them on a skerry, a little rocky place below high water level, so that when the tide comes in, they will drown. They beg for mercy, and he allows them off the skerry in exchange for the precious mead. So that's their payment to escape. And so that's, in other words, the giant's son, Suttungr, accepts the poetic mead as a compensation price for the death of his father. It's a little bit convoluted, this story. So next, Suttungr takes the mead and hides it in a mountain called Hnitbjörg and puts his daughter Gunnlöður in charge. So that's the first part of the story. And then Bragi asks, but how did the Æsir get hold of the Suttung's mead? So one of the kennings for poetry is Suttung's mead. Ægir explains that it was stolen by Odin, who, with the help of Suttung's brother Baugi, bores a hole into the mountain with an auger and transforms himself into a snake and crawls through the hole where he lay with Gunlother for 3 nights, and in exchange she let him have 3 draughts of the mead. In other words, he seduces Gunlother, and in exchange she allows him to have 3 drinks of the mead. But he tricks her and he drinks all of the mead, and then he turns himself into an eagle and flew as hard as he could home to Asgard. So the gods are waiting for Odin, and they put out some containers to take the mead, and Odin spits the mead into the containers. But Suttungr is following him in the shape of an eagle as well, and he's under such stress because he almost doesn't make it, that and this is the direct translation, Odin is forced to release some of the liquid backwards. In other words, through his anus. So like shit, to be direct. And so because of this story now, I could have gone on to the next slide. Because of this story, Snorri says, thus we call poetry Odin's booty, or theft, and find, and his drink, and his gift, and the Aesir's drink. So now we're getting into the kind of explanations behind the mythological explanations behind these kennings that otherwise would be very difficult to decipher. And he lists them here. Feng, so Odin's find, Odin's booty, Odin's find, Odin's drink, Odin's gift, and the drink of the gods. We also can talk about poetry in terms of those 3 vessels, whose names were Odrerir, Botn, and Son. So liquid of Odrerir, liquid of Botn, liquid of Son. It can also be called a conveyance, a means of transportation of the dwarves, because the mead was their means of escape. So poetry is sometimes called ship of the dwarves. It's called Suttung's mead, mjöd, in Old Icelandic is quite like the English form, or Hnitbarga lög, which is the liquid of Hnitbjörg, the mountain where the mead was kept. It can be called the blood of Kvasir, that mythical being, the ship of the dwarves, the mead of the dwarves, the mead of the giants, the mead of Suttung, and many more of these kind of poetical synonyms. And we find these all throughout Skaldic poetry. So indeed, and we'll look at some examples soon, most of these kennings are corroborated in independent Skaldic sources. But what is Skaldic poetry that I've been talking about? So Skaldic is derived from the word for poet in Icelandic, skald, and that word its etymology is disputed, but it probably originally had negative connotations, and it might be cognate with the word scold in English, because its primary use originally may have been to slander or lampoon or mock an enemy in verse. Now, we know that such this function existed because we still have records of laws prohibiting this practice. They were taken very seriously, slanderous verse, because it could be learned and repeated and was capable of great damage to people's reputation. Often the slanderous verses, which we call nidvisur, focused on carried sexual connotations of sexual perversion, and these were highly damaging and humiliating if one of these verses was composed about you, and they were prohibited by the laws. At the same time, in the same way that you could damage a person's reputation, a poet had the power to aggrandize the reputation of a person in the form of a praise poem. And this is one of the main functions of Skaldic poets that we know of from the 9th to the 13th centuries. they would go around writing, or not writing, sorry, because most of this would have been oral composition, composing extended panegyrics, such as which were called draupur in Old Icelandic. And this was one of the main ways by which these poets earned their living. They would go to a king, deliver a long praise poem in his honor, and then the king would be expected, or a lord or a chief, to reward them with gold or costly gifts. Many skalds spent extended periods of time at court, and some Norwegian kings had whole troops of poets in their retinue, such as King Hardraudi, the Hard Ruler, who was supposedly had 13 poets at any one time. So it's a very important profession at the time. We don't have much information about how the poets were trained, although it seems to have been a talent that ran in the family. So if your father was a poet, you would be a poet too. And the scholars themselves attribute their skill to this fabulous mythical poetic mead, that they just have this divine gift from Odin, and that's why they're able to compose poetry. So these references to the composition of poetry by the poets usually take the form of kennings, like we've looked at a few examples already, and again usually occur in these praise poems. So the skald will begin a poem, often in the first stanza, by talking about the fact that he's composing poetry. So as one example of this practice, I'm going to take a look at a couple of verses from a poet called Egil Skallagrimsson. And he has, if you've never heard of skaldic poetry, you might have heard of the Icelandic family sagas. So this is one of the most famous Icelandic family sagas. It tells the story of Egil and his family, as you might expect. And he's one of the first Icelandic poets that we know of. So his father or grandfather emigrated from Norway to Iceland, and Egil lived in the 10th century. So it's most likely he did really exist, that he was a historical character. But as the Icelandic sagas were written 2 or 3 centuries later, we have to treat these stories with caution. They're certainly not 100% true, and it's hard to evaluate how much does reflect reality. But he most likely was indeed a poet who existed in the 10th century, and a lot of his poetry has survived. So I'm going to look at an episode just to give you an idea of how this kind of poetry was performed or produced. Now, Egil is not a sympathetic kind of hero of a story. He's an arrogant, cantankerous troublemaker who's constantly getting himself into trouble. And this episode that we're going to look at occurs within the context of an ongoing feud between himself and the Norwegian royal family, in this case King Eric Bloodaxe and his wife Queen Gunhild. So at this time, Egil finds himself, he's traveling from Iceland to Norway, but he's blown off course and his ship runs aground in the mouth of the River Humber in what's now East Yorkshire. Very unfortunately for him, it turns out that the people ruling the Kingdom of York are his worst enemies, Eric and Gunhild. And he decides he has no choice but to just show up in York at their court and beg for mercy. Now, considering that Egil has previously composed slanderous verse about the king, which, as I mentioned before, is a very serious crime, and has killed many of his kinsmen, including Eric's son, this doesn't seem to be a very intelligent thing to do. But he goes ahead anyway and arrives at court, and indeed the Queen immediately asks that he be executed at once. However, Egil's best friend Arnbjorn manages to persuade the king to allow Egil to compose and recite a poem in his honor, claiming If Egil has slandered the king, he can pay compensation for it in laudatory words that will last until the end of time. The king agrees, and he's sufficiently appeased by the result, so he lets Egil keep his head, and that gives the poem the name Höfuðlausn, or the head ransom. So I have my doubts personally about the historical accuracy of this episode. I think it's just a literary motif, and it's but it still gives us an idea of how praise poems could be recited and performed. Now, compared to some of Egil's other work, I'm not sure that I wouldn't even say, I don't think Egil even composed this really, but we'll take it at face value. It's not as interesting as his other poetry. It's fairly impersonal, formulaic, focusing on praising the king in a series of cliches regarding his generosity and bravery in battle, in the style of most of these kind of praise poems. But it's a perfectly good poem, and the opening stanzas make reference to the situation that Egil finds himself in. And this is the first one. So if you want to try and follow the Old Norse is on the left here, and the English translation is on the right. So he says, I went westward over sea, and I bear the sea of the mine coast of Vidrir. Such is my situation. I launched a ship afloat. At the time of the breaking of the ice floes, I loaded the stern of my vessel with a cargo of praise. Now, this is a little bit, this opening line is one of the discrepancies that we have between the poetry and the prose context, because if he's going from Iceland to Norway, he was going east, not west. But anyway, we won't get into that debate in this lecture. So let's just say he's traveling, and then we get the first kenning here. He says, I bear en ik bear Vidris Mundstrandarmar. The syntax of Skaldic verse is extremely complicated, so it's a bit hard to follow word for word. So what is the sea of the mine coast of Vidrir? Well, again, if you need to know something about Old Norse mythology to be able to decipher this kenning. Vidrir is one of Odin's many, many, many other names. I think there's about 100. So it's something to do with Odin. And then Mine Coast here, Vidrir literally means storm controller, the one who controls the storm. And then to understand Mine Coast, we have to know that in Skaldic poetry, body parts are often referred to in terms of landscape. So the head can be the land of the hair can be forest of the scalp, and so on. Again, these kind of kennings that are a little bit more logical, if you think about it. So here, any landscape feature can stand for land. So land, coast, beach, fjords, mountain, cliff, any of those are like synonyms for land, territory in Skaldic poetry. And the land of the mind means the place where your mind resides, which for the medieval Scandinavians or Icelanders meant the chest. They didn't know or believe that the head was associated with the mind at all. So they believed that the chest was the place where the mind, and indeed the seat of emotions, was located. So mind and heart are in the chest. So now we know that it's the mind of the chest of Odin. And the sea, again, if we go back to that idea that in Skaldic poetry, things that have the same sort of qualities can represent each other, well, then we can see that sea is representing liquid. So the liquid of Odin's chest refers to this poetic mead, to this drink that he, as an eagle, in the form of an eagle, brought back to Asgard, the home of the gods. So it's a pretty convoluted way of referring to poetry. But one of the reasons that Skaldic poetry is so full of these complicated kennings is it makes it easier for the poet to find, you can see I've highlighted them here, alliterating words, which was part of the rules, and other internal rhyme that was necessary for the composition of Skaldic poetry. And then down here we see, I loaded the stern of my vessel with the cargo of praise. Again, this may be another kenning for chest, although that's not 100% sure. And a cargo of praise, he's referring to praise poetry. In the second stanza, he says, the king offered hospitality to me. Again, a bit of a stretch of the truth, if we take the prose context to be the accurate one. I have an obligation here with regard to a praise poem, and here we get another kenning. A more straight, one that you'll understand now, I think. I bear the mead of Odin to the lands of the Angles. So the mead of Odin, Odin's mead, is poetry. So he's saying, I'm coming to you here with the poem. So yeah, at the end of the day, Egil is just saying in a very roundabout way that he's bringing poetry with him. But it's not simply that. He's showing his skill as a poet. It's adding adornment to the poem. And also these allusions to the origin of poetry are a means to remind the audience of the divine link between poets and Odin. So it's a way of giving themselves prestige. So I've just, on the next table, given some more examples of this type of kenning, which we can call Odin's drink. So this is by far the most common kenning for poetry and the most widely distributed across the corpus. So here we have the head word is drink, qualified by or determined by another poetic, determined by Odin or one of his many names. So as I said before, drink, synonyms for drink in these kennings could be ale, any drink, ale, mead, wine, beer, the cupful, liquid, any water from nature, wave, sea, rain, waterfall, any of those, determined by Odin. So the liquid of Odin, or one of his many names. Some of them are simpler and some of them are more complicated. So for example, I'm not going to give many more examples of these throughout the lecture because it can get a bit tedious. But just to give you a taste, I've made a little table here of a few examples. So for example, this is the oldest skald we know of, Bragi in Gamli, the Bragi the Old. And he was a Norwegian skald who, semi-legendary, we're not entirely sure if he really existed, and he lived in the 9th century. And this is from the first verse of a poem to a troll. Anyway, here we get a kenning, Igs Ölberry. So the ale is ale of Igr, another of the Odin's names, the terrible one. Okay, so once you translate, it just becomes Odin's mead, i.e. poetry. Another 10th century poet here, Eyvindur Skalda Spidler Finnsson. A lot of skalds have these kind of epithets or nicknames referring to their poetic trade. And this one means plagiarist. So he must have copied someone else's poem at some stage. Anyway, from his poem Hauleie Tal, we get this one, Kverleyi Farn Skalga. Now we have a kenning within a kenning here, and sometimes in the very complicated ones they can have up to 5 elements, which can get tricky to unpack. But here we have to start here with Farms Galga. Galga are the gallows, and farm is a burden, and the burden of the gallows is Odin, and that goes back to a story where Odin hung himself on a tree for 9 nights. He sacrificed himself to himself in order to gain wisdom. So the burden of the gallows is Odin. And then Kverlog is liquid of the cauldron. So drink, liquid. So again, we're back to the basic kenning, which is Odin's drink. Here we get, in another 10th century poet, Einar Skála Glam, which seems to mean tinkled scales. In his poem Valekla, he calls poetry Vaugar Rognis, the wave of Rognir, yet another name for Odin. And finally, Arnor Jarlaskald, in other words, the poet of the Earls, in a poem called Thorfinnsdrápa. This Drápa means a praise poem. He refers to poetry as the surf of malt. So the surf here being the sea. Malt is, of course, what ale is made from. Of Allfather, the All-Father Odin. So again, they're all just different ways of saying Odin's mead. And there are about 42 of those that I found in the Skaldic corpus, just based on that Odin's drink. We also get kennings for, I'm just put the translations in English now to save time. Dwarves drink, because of course the mead was also associated with those dwarves, Fjallar and Galar, who brewed it from honey and Kvasir's blood. Now, again, you can substitute in Skaldic poetry any name of any dwarf to mean dwarf. So Sudri is a dwarf, Dain is a dwarf, Thorin is a dwarf. It sounds like the Lord of the Rings. Dvalin is a dwarf. And so Sudri's mead, dwarves drink, wave of Dain, all of these just mean dwarves drink, i.e. the poetic mead again. And the drink can also be giants drink. Same thing. Any name of a giant, Surtur, Hrimnir, Gillingur, like we know from our story, they just refer to giant. And the giants were the people of the rocks or the mountains. So I mentioned before how we can use landscape terminology to describe parts of the body, but also vice versa. So the shoulder of the land is a rock, and the people of the rock are the giants, and the ale of the giants is poetry. Here we get a different type of liquid, stream, this time from the horn. So drinking horns were one of the utensils that they would have used to drink from in the Middle Ages in Scandinavia. So the stream of the horn is the liquid from the cup of Hrimnir, a giant. So the giants drink, poetry again. This one is a bit more complicated. My yeast Rhine, in other words, water, yeast, water is ale. Of the mudmen, these are the giants of the rocks. And another one, which isn't giant's drink actually, so I shouldn't have that there, but well, sort of is. This is Gjöldum Gillingur, the payment or the compensation from Gillingur, if we remember that the dwarves had to pay the mead in compensation for his death. So it's another kenning. These are the most common ones. And my point is that all of these, to understand what these mean, you need to know the story of the origin of the poetic mead. A few more, less frequent, well, we've already looked at some of these actually. Vidr's theft, Vidr is another name for Odin. Fjölnir's booty, another name for Odin. So we have Odin's drink, and we also have Odin's find, theft, booty, the thing that he took back to Ausgard is the poetry. And I've got a mistake here. So that this should be 2 different bullet points. Now going back to our friend Egil Skallagrimsson, he says in one of his poems, Sonatoric, he calls poetry that joyful find of Frigg's kin born out of yore out of giant land. Now Frigg is Odin's wife, So Frigg's kin is Odin. Odin's find is the poetry. And we get this added piece of information that he took out of Yor, an old kind of archaic way of saying years ago, from Giant Land. And then we get a similar thing here with Eyvindir, called it the cauldron drink of the burden of the gallows. We've seen that before. That which the travel further, i.e. Odin, carried flying from the treasure valleys of Surtur the giant. So again, all of these kennings are sort of confirming the version that Snorri tells us of the origin of the poetic Mead. And we get as we saw before, when this is an 18th century manuscript illustrated, and this is supposed to be Odin in the form of an eagle flying back to Asgard. And here are the vessels that the gods have put out for him. And there he is spitting the mead into those containers. This is Suttungr behind him, chasing him. And here's what happens to poor Odin. He's so stressed as he's being chased that some of the mead goes out the back way. And we have a few kennings referring to this. The lump dew of Hoar's cask rim. Well, Hoar is Odin, his cask rim is his bottom, and the lump dew is the waste mead. The dung of the ancient eagle, the same thing, and the mud of the carrion sea vulture. Again, in Skaldic poetry, similar birds can represent each other. So a vulture can be an eagle, and so on. And interestingly, I think in this last one, usually this bad poetry, sometimes poets refer to their own poetry as bad, to be in sort of modest. But in the case of this last one, this is actually occurs in a verse mocking Snorri Sturluson for his bad poetry. So it can be an insult as well. Now, so so far we have a relatively coherent account of this origin myth. You might have seen a few holes in the narrative, but so far it holds together, and it seems to be corroborated by these sources, these kennings in Skaldic poetry. However, if we look a bit closer, we can see that there's some discrepancies. And I want to look now at the other main, well, I hesitate to say source of the myth because it mightn't be that at all. But there is a reference, there's in a poem called Hávamál, which is called in English, The Sayings of the High One. We get what may be references to the myth of the poetic Mead, or may not, depending on how you interpret. Now, sorry, just a second. Snorri's text is known as the Prose Edda, and Hávamál is the first in a collection which we usually call the Poetic Edda. This is a collection of poetry with mythological and legendary content, mostly it's in a manuscript called the Codex Regius, a very humble but very valuable manuscript, which was unearthed in Iceland in the 16th century, I think, and preserved a lot of stories which up to that time they thought had been lost. So Hávamál is one of the mythological poems, and it's basically kind of like a series of gnomic verses, wisdom poetry, a bit disconnected sometimes, but it also strays into short narratives or little allusions to stories about Odin. So we're going to look at stanzas 13 and 14, translated. And here Odin says, "The heron of forgetfulness hovers over the ale drinking. He steals men's wits. With the feathers of this bird I was fettered in the court of Gunlod. Drunk I was more than drunk at wise Fjalar's. That's the best sort of ale drinking, when afterwards everyone's got his mind back again." Indeed. These texts are sometimes quite obscure, and no one is really sure what the heron of forgetfulness means, but it's basically in the context of advice about drinking. Don't drink too much. But here we get this reference to Gunlod. So Odin is saying, or appears to be saying, that he got very drunk at Gunlod's court. Now, if you remember, Gunlod, or in Icelandic Gunnlöður, is the daughter of Suttungr, who in Snorri's version was seduced by Odin, and we assume tricked into giving him the mead when she didn't want to, and she was stuck in a mountain guarding the mead. But this is a different sort of, seems to be a different situation. And then here we get a reference to Fjalar, which in Snorri's story is one of the dwarves, but here appears to be a giant. So we have there's a lack of correspondence between these two. Further on in the poem, and I haven't printed all the verses, but stanzas 104 to 110 give us a bit more detail. Kind of summary here. So here we're told that Odin visits Suttum's hall. Now we get Suttum referred to, Gunnlod's father. For Gunnlod, sitting on a golden throne, gives him a drink of the precious mead. So again, a very different story from what we know from Odin. "A poor reward I gave her in return," Odin says. And now it seems that instead of the story where in Snorri's version, with the help of Suttum's brother Baugi, he bores a hole through the mountain to get in. Here it seems to be that he's getting out. He escaped out through the hole. He says he escapes by gnawing through the stone with the mouth of the auger, this tool that will bore a hole. "Over and under me went the paths of the giants, thus I risked my head." And then some of the lines in this poem are very corrupt, and we're not entirely sure what they mean. But in this stanza 107, there seems to be some kind of bargain. He says, "Vel caped lead," I think, "litar," I think is the original. And that's not clear what that means. This translator says cheaply bought beauty. I think it's probably accounting for poetry, but anyway. "The wise lack for little." So he made good use of something, and now it's of use to the wise. And here we got this reference to Odrerir, which, if you remember, was the name of one of those containers of the mead back in Snorri's version. And again, this line is corrupt. We don't really know what that means. He says, "I am in doubt as to whether I could have come back from the courts of the giants if I had not made use of Gunnlöður, that good woman, and put my arms around her." The next day, the frost giants went to ask for the High One's advice in the High One's hall. They asked about Bolverk, which is the name of Odin in another situation, whether he was amongst the gods or whether Suttung had slaughtered him. "I thought Odin had sworn a sacred ring oath." In other words, put his hand on a ring and sworn it. How can his word be trusted? He left Suttung betrayed at the feast and made Gunnlod weep. So again, even though we have some references that overlap with the Snorri version, in this case, some scholars have suggested that Odin has entered into kind of a marriage arrangement, perhaps with Gunnlöður, and then has betrayed them. He has made a promise and then he's broken his promise. And it's also worth in the previous section. Sorry, in this section, I haven't got it there. Gunload gives him a drink of the mead from a golden throne. This is, I think, stanza 104. There is Baugi boring into the hole with the auger. Finally, in stanzas 140, 141, I don't have them on the slide, Odin says, 9 mighty spells I learned from the famous son of Balthar Bestla's father, in other words, from himself, and I got a drink of the precious mead poured from Odrerir. And then I began to quicken and to be wise and to grow and to prosper. One word found another word for me, one deed found another deed for me. So he's getting some kind of wisdom from the drink. But at no point is there any connection with poetry in the Hávamál. The only way we could possibly interpret it as being an inspiration is that he becomes more loquacious, but it's associated with wisdom. Now, at this point, we have no other Germanic medieval literature, Old High German or Anglo-Saxon, have preserved any reference to this myth at all. So the only other Germanic source that maybe we have for this myth is a carving on a rune stone in Sweden, which has been dated to the 7th century, 700, which possibly, and this is always a bit dubious, represents Odin in the form of an eagle. So you can see kind of a man shape within the eagle shape, receiving the mead of poetry from Gunlod, with Suttungr standing behind her. If this interpretation is true, that's a slightly different version, because he didn't turn into an eagle until he was escaping in Snorri's version. But it may corroborate, at least, that this myth was known that early in Scandinavia. But that's all. It doesn't really give us, and it might be something completely different. It's impossible to know. So to try and find some ways to corroborate this myth outside of Germanic literature, we can turn to some other, I'm not going to get into them because I don't have time, but there are well-known similar tales in other Indo-European traditions. So in ancient Greek literature or mythology, we know that ambrosia is the food of the gods, of the immortals. It keeps them immortal. Similarly, in the Vedic or the Sanskrit ancient Indian tradition, Amritam or Soma is the food that keeps the gods immortal. And there are lots of stories relating to how do the gods get their food. So, for example, ambrosia is supposedly brought to Zeus by a flight of doves from a remote source beyond the clashing rocks. So 2 rocks that clash together, and one of the birds is always caught by the rocks as they slam together. So a bird always dies in the attempt, but he's replaced by Zeus. And in the Rig Veda, the Sanskrit Vedic text, there are many allusions to the story that the Soma, so this food of the immortals, was brought to Indra from the furthest heaven by an eagle or falcon called Garuda, which means Soma thief. So you can hear the connection, I think, to our Old Norse myth. And in the most explicit account, the Soma's guardian, Krishnu, shot an arrow at the bird and sheared off one of his tail feathers. So we can recognize here a motif, a fairly widespread motif, that the elixir of life is located in a location that's difficult to access, and it's one thing is getting in, but it's almost impossible to get out without losing something, which in the Greek version is a bird, a dove. In the Rig Veda, Indra loses some tail feathers, and in our Old Norse text, Odin loses some of his drink. So some more similarities between Soma and the poetic mead. Well, it was the food of the gods rather than the drink of poetic inspiration, but it was associated with poetry and poets and inspiration, and it was brewed from a herb also known as Soma, and presented as an offering to the god who was also known as Soma in an ancient ritual which took place over a 3-day period, and 3 different vessels were used. So again, possibly these 3 vessels are the 3 vats or containers that Snorri refers to. So we can see that Snorri's story may well have roots in an ancient proto-myth of Indo-European origin. The belief of capturing the magic drink in an accessible place and the birds. And the motif of the clashing rocks may be reflected in Old Norse, because the mountain Hnitbjörg means crashing cliffs. So that could well preserve that. Regarding the story of Hávamál, one suggestion to try to explain that is that a scholar called Svava Jakobsdóttir proposes a model for this in versions of so-called hierogamy. In other words, holy or sacred marriages often taking the form of ritualistic sexual acts between gods and goddesses, etc. And she cites a number of Irish tales regarding ancient royal consecration ceremonies, and she thinks this may reflect an ancient tale about Odin confirming his right to be the highest god. And she quotes a story, Baljan Skál, for example, where a maiden sits on a crystal throne. Standing beside her is a silver barrel full of red ale, along with a golden ladle and a golden cup. So again, she's got 3 vessels, and she offers a drink to the king. And this may be an analogue for the Gunload part of the story, so that wasn't really part of the original myth, but over time, because both stories deal with this precious, intoxicating magic liquid, they were merged together by Snorri or a previous scholar to him. So, I'm going to try to finish up briefly.
Excuse me, I don't want. Yes, thank you.
Okay. I just want to briefly mention, but I don't have time to discuss it, another Irish story which is called The Cauldron of Poesy. And this is another poetical treatise which talks about how there's 3 cauldrons, Cuire Geirith, Cuire Ermi, and Cuire Sophis, and each one seems to represent a different aspect of poetical composition. And although this text is clearly, this is not mythological, this is a scholar using the idea of the cauldron as a metaphor, that each poet has 3 cauldrons within them, and from these cauldrons come these different abilities. I think I was inspired by that to start thinking about, and I'm going to finish now, how I wonder to what extent Snorri's story is based on ancient Indo-European myth, which it clearly is to a certain extent, and to what extent does it consist of poetical metaphors, maybe made literally, turned literal into mythical elements of a story. So, for example, the idea of a song or poetry as something that runs liquidly is a very ancient metaphor in Indo-European poetry. So possibly at some stage this metaphor of poetry as liquid became transformed into a story which said it really was a liquid in the first place. We also get the idea of poetry as a ship. Again, this is a very old idea, the ship of poetry, which would have long preceded Snorri's time or even Old Norse literature. So again, maybe the idea of a ship of poetry, when it lost was explained later by scholars or poets as being a real ship that did exist in a myth was made by dwarves. So I'm just going to I think perhaps Snorri or similar scholars to him is nostalgic about the old kennings and wishes to revive the art. So in his eagerness, he possibly invents explanation based on false etymologies or half-remembered stories for the past, thus creating a mishmash myth of the origin of poetic mead, which does not contradict the evidence in kennings, obviously because he used those to write the story in the first place, but does not entirely make sense when analysed thoroughly. We must be very grateful to Snorri Sturluson, because without him, a great amount of knowledge would have been lost. However, despite his best efforts, although it survived into the 14th century, the poet stopped employing kennings associated with pagan ideas, and indeed deliberately want to disassociate themselves from the idea of Odin's mead as a source of their poetic inspiration. I'm just going to finish on one last example. Here's a Bishop Bjarni Kolbeinsson writing composing in the 13th century, and he says, this verse is kind of corrupt, so we've got some missing bits, but he says, I was not under waterfalls, whatever that means. I never engaged in enchantments. I did not learn poetry from Odin. So for all Snorri's best efforts, Christian poets in the later 13th and 14th centuries stop using pagan kennings, but we have that thanks to his Edda. We still have the knowledge, and we can still continue to study and try and get to the bottom of it all. So thank you very much for your attention. Sorry, I've gone a bit over time.
Thank you very much, Edel, for this. I think it was really so much information. I am absolutely gobsmacked by the secret language, basically, that all these kennings are weaving into these poems. It's as if you needed a decoder, or actually a lot of insight into the mythology in order to understand these texts. So I wonder, this would have been one of the questions I would have asked you, how many people originally could have understood? I mean, I'm intrigued by the fact that it is almost as if it were a secret language. So I wonder whether it's only the aristocrats and those who are in the know, the people who live at court might understand these kennings, or if it's like this, it's the ethnic context in which they live. So that would have been one question, and the other one would have what's the alcoholic component of literal mead? Could it be that there are so many cultures that use different substances in order to communicate with the divine? And of course, it is in classical Greece we have this connection between poetry and the gods and the divine, this spirit that imbues the mortal. In this case, you get imbibed by the mead. So maybe it has something to do with the very literal fact that if you partake of alcohol in a very literal sense, you might get this connection with the divine. In many cultures, something that is done various psychotropic substances or via alcohol. But we for a debate. So, oh yeah, just very
quickly regarding your first question, we don't know exactly to what extent people understood those verses, and it's not just the diction that's the problem. The syntax is very complicated too. So, but there are it seems that people well versed would understand them, and others might take longer. But certainly it was seems to have been an elite who would have understood. Regarding the intoxicating liquor, of course, and Odin is an Old English wodan, and that comes from a word meaning in a frenzy or mad. This I just didn't have time to go into all of these. The name of this vessel and the name for poetry also can mean possessed or mad frenzy. So there is a very strong link between Odin is a shamanistic god too. So there's a very strong link between alcoholic imbibing alcohol and that as a source of inspiration in itself. Not just in Old Norse, you see that in other, like you say, other cultures too. But I opened a bit of a seeing as we're on a mythical team, Caja de Pandora here, that I really didn't expect when I started to write this letter. I thought it was going to be more straightforward.
Thank you much for being here. And if anybody would like to ask her questions, your email address is edith.porter@uclm.us. And of course, if you just name, will be Google. So I'm now going to stop and I'm going to welcome